Hello and welcome to Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. I'm Ian Masters, and today we'll examine a number of stories and issues in the news. We'll begin with today's public testimony from Jack Smith, who House Republicans tried to discredit while Trump called him a, quote, deranged animal, but Smith made it clear that he will not be intimidated. Joining us is Lisa Graves, one of the nation's foremost experts on the right-wing influence on the United States Supreme Court and other levels of power. She leads True North Research and co-hosts Legal AF and has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article 3 Judges Division for the U.S. Courts. And she's the author of the new book, Without Precedent: How Chief Justice Roberts and his accomplices rewrote the Constitution and dismantled our rights. Then we'll assess the latest polls from Times, Siena, CNN, and The Economist YouGov that find support for Trump from young Americans has done a U-turn, and the same conditions that dragged down Biden to defeat are now weighing on Trump. We will speak with Joseph Lowndes, a professor of political science at Hunter College and the director of Public Policy Program at the Roosevelt House at the City University of New York. An expert on conservatism, the Tea Party, social movements, the GOP, race and elections. He's the author of From the New Deal to the New Right, Race and the Southern Origins of Modern Conservatism, and the co-author of Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race, and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. Then finally, with the Democratic House and Senate leaders unwilling to go to the mat to reform ICE, we will speak with Will Bunch, national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and author of several books, including The Backlash, Right-Wing Radicals, Paranoia Politics, and High-Def Huxlers in the Age of Obama, and The Byrne Identity, A Search for Bernie Sanders and the New American Dream. He has won numerous journalism awards and shared the Pulitzer Prize, and we will discuss his latest article at the Philadelphia Inquirer, When Will Democrats Realize That You Can't Reform Fascism? And before we begin at the start of this new year, which will culminate in the fateful midterm elections in November, polls already indicate MAGA Republicans will lose the House and possibly the Senate. But we're up against a Trump-Miller presidency already drunk with power, and they will do anything to stay in power, having already demonstrated their contempt for the United States Constitution with Trump's January 6, 2001 coup attempt. They see over half of the country as their enemy and have a private army of loyal thugs ready to round up critics of the regime they label as communist lunatics. As Trump cowers, the media and his cronies buy up the mainstream press, Background Briefing will continue to expose this malevolent regime's fascistic machinations, providing a daily insight into the news as a massive coalition of people power is mobilized to bring about an end to this nightmare and usher in a new era of reform not seen since Nixon departed the presidency in disgrace. To help save America's 250-year-old democracy, we need all hands on deck, and you can make a tax-deductible donation to help us do our part at backgroundbriefing.org/donate or at publictruthmedia.org. And thank you. And joining us now is Lisa Graves, one of the nation's foremost experts on the right-wing influence on the U.S. Supreme Court and other levels of power. She leads True North Research and co-hosts Legal AF and has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government. Welcome to Background Briefing, Lisa Graves.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us. And what did you make of today's public testimony from Jack Smith? Obviously, he testified to the House Judiciary Committee in private, but now he was able to testify in public. The Republicans tried to do their best to discredit him. Donald Trump on Truth Social called him a deranged animal, but it seems to me that Smith made it pretty clear that he's not going to be intimidated.
Yes, he made that very clear, and I think it was really important to see that hearing live, to have people be able to see it, not just read it or learn more about it, secondhand. And he testified very credibly. His statements are very clear. He is clearly a brave person who is uncowed by Donald Trump's threats. and also by the circus that the Republicans tried to create around this testimony. It really was appalling to hear the claims being made by Jim Jordan and others. They're just so false and repugnant. And also, I think the way that some of the Republicans treated the Capitol Police members or former Capitol Police members who were there at that hearing, it's just disgusting to see these loyalists, these sycophants, trying to recreate history and try to ignore what actually happened, what they themselves saw with their own eyes, what we all saw with our own eyes, which is how Donald Trump incited that riot to try to stop the peaceful transition of power in order to illegitimately stay in power, even though he was defeated.
Well, one of the Democratic congressmen asked Jack Smith whether he thinks that the Justice Department would find a way to indict him. And Smith said, I believe they will do everything in their power to do that because they have been ordered to by the president. And that is very concerning. So it's obvious, isn't it, that these are just Trump's lackeys, and they're shameless. And I'm astounded that they can keep it up because Trump is clearly losing it. So why are they so pathetically loyal to this sinking ship?
Well, I personally think that Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche should be impeached. They are not doing the work of the Justice Department, the independent work, the fair-minded work that is the tradition of that department. Instead, they're acting like they are Trump's personal lawyers, but with the powers of the federal government behind them. Over and over again, they have been doing his bidding in contravention of longstanding laws, precedents, procedures, policies, and instead they act basically as his tools, as his servants, when that's not the role of the Justice Department. That's not the traditional role of the Department of Justice, but they were handpicked and chosen as people who Trump knew would be loyal to him above all else. And I mean, it is genuinely appalling. I'm filled with revulsion to see what has happened to the U.S. Department of Justice on their watch and what continues to happen. And I do think, as Jack Smith said, that they are going to go after him and others. In fact, Trump has been urging that, as we saw in the tweet a month or so ago as well, to go after the people who he considers his enemies. This is, Nixon's dream. But that's not supposed to be the reality in America. And so it is genuinely appalling to see these personal operatives of Trump invested with such power and going after people of such deep integrity like Jack Smith. Although, of course, they haven't yet, pursued him, but it certainly seems like it's in the offing.
So if you go back to January the 6th and shortly thereafter, or even during January the 6th, all of these junkyard dogs on Fox News, these pathetic sycophants, these propagandists for Trump, the Pravda of the Republican Party, they're a shameful bunch. But they were all lobbying the chief of staff at the time, sending him desperate messages as they watched the video of the Capitol being stormed, as we all saw, and the ugliness of Trump's supporters and the brutality of their beating up the cops. The Hannitys and the Ingrams, etc., all begging Trump's chief of staff to have him stop this because this is bad for us. This looks bad. And then right after, I think the very next day, Mitch McConnell took to the Senate floor and basically told the Democrats that you can put this guy in jail. So let's just play a clip, because reality, of course, has been changed by Trump and his lackeys. They've tried to turn history on its head and make up, down, and black, white. But the truth ultimately still hovers there. So let's go back to January the 6th with Mitch McConnell.
There's no question, none, that President Trump is practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day. No question about it. The people who stormed this building believed they were acting on the wishes and instructions of their president. And having that belief was a foreseeable consequence of the growing crescendo of false statements, conspiracy theories, and reckless hyperbole which the defeated president kept shouting into the largest megaphone on planet Earth. As Justice Story explained, the Senate, upon conviction, is bound in all cases to enter a judgment of removal from office. Removal is mandatory upon conviction. Clearly, he explained, that mandatory sentence cannot be applied to someone who's left office. The entire process revolves around removal. If removal becomes impossible, conviction becomes insensible. Impeachment, conviction, and removal are a specific intra-governmental safety valve. It is not the criminal justice system where individual accountability is the paramount goal. We have a criminal justice system in this country. We have civil litigation. And former presidents are not immune from being accountable by either one.
And you've just been listening to Mitch McConnell's stance in the United States Senate shortly after January the 6th. So what happened, Lisa? Why didn't we take advantage of that moment when Trump should have been put in jail?
Well, I really appreciated Mitch McConnell's statements immediately after January 6th, but what I didn't appreciate is what happened next, which was that he blocked there from being an emergency session for the Senate to pursue that trial while Trump was in office. Of course, the timing was going to be challenging because this happened on January 6th, and the swearing in of the new president of Joe Biden was scheduled by Constitution on January 20th. But McConnell blocked that from happening before January 20th. And so that was part of the challenge we faced. Of course, during that trial or after that trial, McConnell then suggested that, of course, Trump could be pursued through criminal law, even though in his view, he could not be impeached from an office he no longer held. But then, of course, that came in John Roberts, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a man who was handpicked to lead the revolution on the Supreme Court back in 2005 to roll back our rights. And in 2024, we all saw John Roberts move heaven and earth to construct unprecedented counter-constitutional immunity from criminal prosecution for Donald Trump retrospectively, basically pardoning him in effect, and prospectively paving the way for his return to power. So McConnell was right in the sense that everyone could see what Trump did, that this was not possible without the lies, the disinformation that Trump had been spreading. That as McConnell said, and I rarely credit McConnell because I've fought him over the years about the court packing that he was instrumental to, but he was right when he said that Trump was practically and morally responsible for providing the conditions for the attack on the Capitol, the actual insurrection, not the claimed insurrection that Trump has been talking about in Minnesota with people, peacefully responding to this invasion by Trump paramilitary operatives. But the fact is that McConnell sort of played both roles in essence. He both called out the president in the immediate aftermath, the president at the time, Donald Trump, in the immediate aftermath of January 6th. But then he helped block the impeachment of Donald Trump. And in fact, there were a substantial majority of members voted for that impeachment, including every Democrat and several Republicans, but they fell a couple votes short of the supermajority required in the Senate under the Constitution, and that was in part because of Mitch McConnell.
So what went wrong then in terms of, because that was the time to stop him, and he's gained more and more strength, and he's rewritten history, and he's got his followers believing in the lies that he foisted. Obviously, history will judge him accurately, but you have to admit that his willpower is extraordinary, and the sycophants are still out there, and we're talking about them because they were on display today on the Republican side of the House Judiciary Committee. But Biden, like Obama after the 2008 crash, didn't want to go after Wall Street. He basically said, let's look forward, not look backwards. And Biden said the same thing when he came in. Let's look forward and let's not look backwards. And it seemed to me that that was a missed opportunity. And how long later did the January 6th committee finally reveal what happened? Years later. And what happened with the Attorney General? He started to go after the small fry, not starting at the top. And even Jack Smith seemed to have made some misjudgments, particularly in the case of the Florida documents case, where he should have known that Judge Eileen Cannon was completely in Trump's pocket and that case would go nowhere and it should have been tried in Washington.
Well, I share your criticisms. The fact is that after Merrick Garland was appointed to be the Attorney General, the first thing he should have done was to appoint an independent prosecutor to look into the charges that needed to be brought against the person who masterminded what happened on January 6th, who, as McConnell said, was using the biggest bully pulpit in the world to incite this action, to attack the U.S. Capitol. And the fact that Merrick Garland dragged his feet for far too long before he even allowed there to be an appointment of what ultimately, who the person ultimately appointed was obviously Jack Smith. The House committee did a really important set of work, but obviously that work, that investigation, that January 6th investigation was not sufficient to deal with the real issue, which is that Donald Trump should have been barred from power, should have been barred from running again for office, and he should have been prosecuted and convicted of the crimes that there was ample evidence, as Jack Smith revealed, ample evidence to show that he should be convicted of that there was proof beyond a reasonable doubt of his criminal activity. And so I do hold Merrick Garland responsible for that really outrageous, quite frankly, turning of the other cheek, the idea that they should not pursue these grievous crimes against our nation, against our capital, while they did pursue hundreds of other prosecutions, including prosecutions of people like Stuart Rhodes, one of the heads of the Oath Keepers, who was, charged with seditious conspiracy and other serious charges. But because Donald Trump got back into power and used the power of the presidency to pardon people like Stuart Rhodes, and of course, there we had Stuart Rhodes at the hearing today, a man who, should be in jail, should be behind bars for his actions against the United States of America, against we the people. There was Stuart Rhodes both outside and inside hearing today as Jack Smith testified so compellingly about why Donald Trump's prosecution should have continued and how he should be held responsible and should have been held responsible for the crimes that I believe, and most Americans, I think, believe that he committed and saw with our own eyes.
And of course, you had one of the pro-Trump trolls attacking the Capitol Police, who were also testifying or in the audience today. So these people are shameless. They're trying to troll reality.
That's right. That's right. The disrespect for Michael Fanone and for the other Capitol Police who put their lives on the line on January 6th to protect our United States Capitol, protect that official proceeding of the United States, which is the counting of those electoral votes. It is truly, it is just so fundamentally immoral the way some of these people who are such Trump loyalists and such Trump trolls behave toward these brave police officers, toward the truth. It is, it is what they say from the George Orwell novel, which is that basically the regime, the authoritarian regime, demands that you believe their lies. And you saw in that hearing today, both members of Congress and the trolls who support them and back them, trying to recreate history before our very eyes to be aligned with the lies that Trump continues to tell, and that the Trump White House told, in essence, officially on January 6th with its ridiculous website, trying to recreate history yet again about what happened on January 6th.
Well, Lisa Graves, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thanks for having me.
And again, I've been speaking with Lisa Graves, who's one of the nation's foremost experts on the right-wing influence on the United States Supreme Court and other levels of power. She leads True North Research and co-hosts Legal AF and has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as Deputy Chief of the Article 3 Judges Division for the U.S. Courts. And she's the author of the new book, Without Precedent, How Chief Justice Roberts and his accomplices rewrote the Constitution and dismantled our rights. We're going to take a brief station break and back assessing the latest polls from Times, Siena, CNN, and The Economist YouGov that find support for Trump from young Americans has done a U-turn, and the same conditions that dragged down Biden to defeat are now weighing on Trump.
Judge, oh judge, please spare my brother. I will give you gold and silver. I don't want your gold and silver. All I want are your sweet favors.
Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Joseph Lowndes, who is a professor of political science at Hunter College and director of the Public Policy Program at the Roosevelt House at the City University of New York, an expert on conservatism, the Tea Party, social movements, the GOP, race and elections. He's the author of From the New Deal to the New Right, Race and the Southern Origins of Modern Conservatism, and the co-author of Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. Welcome to Background Briefing, Joseph Lowndes.
Thanks so much, Ian. It's nice to be back.
Well, thanks for joining us, Joe. And you studied the capture of a lot of young, particularly white men and even minorities by Trump, both in 2016 and in 2024. But there's apparently a quite stark U-turn that's taken place just after this first year anniversary of Trump's second term. The New York Times Siena poll has only 40% of registered voters saying that they approve of Trump's performance, and young and non-white voters are even likely to disapprove of Trump than they were. And the only people sort of that really do continue to support him are older and white voters. And then there's also the YouGov Economist poll that finds that fewer Americans, at 9%, support the U.S. using military force to take control of Greenland, 72% opposing that. And then you have similarly dismal findings in a CNN poll that just came out, where a majority, that is 58%, call the first year of Trump's term a failure. So what explains this shift, particularly among young white non-college voters and young minority voters?
Well, I think there's a number of things here. You know, with polling, there always is. You have to kind of disaggregate some of the data. But also, I think, broadly, there's a, rubber band snapping back effect that you get in each presidential term headed towards the midterms. And in some ways, this looks like past ones in general, that Trump's approval ratings, declined nationally in the way that they did after his first year in his first term, and the way that Biden's did before the midterms in 2022. But I think the youth vote is very interesting, and you have to break that down as well. Now, of course, young women, let's take Gen Z voters. Young women voted largely along liberal lines for Democrats and expressed progressive opinions across most issue areas, as has been consistently the case for young women for some time. Young men also generally vote and think more progressively than their older peers. But in this last election, it was distinct that young men really veered in a conservative direction. This had been creeping up in the last couple of election cycles previous, but it really became much more distinct in 2024. And so that took some explaining. And part of that, at the time, well, there's been, just gallons and gallons of ink spilled on digital ink spilled on what caused that male youth vote to swing so far to the right. And I think that there's no clear answer to it. I mean, partly there has been kind of an anti-feminist movement which has been growing. A lot of this boosted by influencers and people on TikTok and podcasters. Some of it is kind of an appeal that conservatives and Republicans were able to make in terms of a sense of crisis and masculinity that young men were experiencing across questions of culture, across questions of economics, etc. But there, you can even look at a breakdown that happened. One of the things that demographers studied was a split even among Gen Z men between an older half of the Gen Z generation and the younger half. And the older half tend to be more ideologically consistent, slightly more politically conservative than women their age, but leaning more democratic, kind of centrist, let's say. And younger Gen Z voters seem to have swung wildly to the right in that last election. And so there are questions about whether or not this is a post-pandemic or pandemic and post-pandemic generation, a generation that's more saturated by digital media, a generation that faced more forms of economic precarity, but also that this younger generation of Gen Zers had not experienced a Trump presidency before and did not quite know personally what might be in store for them in a Trump presidency. The kind of the roiling chaos and tension and ongoing crises that marked the first administration, which older Gen Z voters had a sense of. So what happened in this election is that younger Gen Z voters swung more to the left than, or in these polls, they appear to be going more to the left than that older Gen Z group. And so they seem to have gone from farther to the right to farther to the left. There's a Yale youth poll that came out in last December. And there's been other polls that have showed that these young men are more to the left on economics, more to the left on questions of immigration, more to the left on questions of U.S. foreign policy, more to the left on questions of labor, on and on, which is kind of striking. And so there's no clear set of reasons for that. But maybe that this younger group was just less ideologically moored to begin with and more open to different kinds of possibilities. I think a couple things are in the mix here. One of them is that the economy did not get any better. In fact, got quite worse across Trump's first term in a lot of ways. So, the economy kind of helped sink Biden with these voters, but it's helping sink Trump with these voters as well, because he just has not been able to deliver anywhere. And things have, in fact, gotten quite worse in some parts of the economy. The other thing is that Democrats have been able to begin to articulate a more coherent and visionary economic populism, which people call the Mamdani effect. Zohran Mamdani came out with a very strong, very bold, very principled, fighting politics that foregrounded affordability and foregrounded the possibility that working people had things owed to them, that a billionaire class was gobbling up everything. And this was a message that was incredibly resonant. I live in New York City now, and to see 100,000 young canvassers fan out across New York City last year, just tirelessly knocking on doors for Mamdani, brought this person who was a relative unknown to becoming the mayor of New York City in a year. It really tells you something about that. But there's also some way in which he represents a certain kind of progressive masculinity as well, that he offers a different way for young men to imagine themselves, what it might be to hold on to a certain kind of politics which is not grievance based, but might be based in other kinds of political ideas and ideals and other kinds of visions. And so that may be part of it. I think also there's young people have very little to gain out of the U.S. taking Greenland, or very, very little to gain out of the U.S. kidnapping Maduro, very little to gain out of the way that ISIS carried out really what have become murderous campaigns in cities across the country. So, there's not much there that would really appeal to young voters, I think, to begin with. So I think some of this begins to explain what we're seeing, although I don't think we have the whole picture yet.
Well, in terms of Latinos and the Latino vote, only 30% of Latinos and adults younger than 35 approve of Trump, and that's down from 41%. So you would think that actually, you'd think it'd be the numbers would be even worse, given what ICE is doing to Latinos. It's overtly racist, and it's manifestly cruel, and it's escalating.
Yes, I think that effect is going to branch out. I think a lot of Latino voters in questions who were Trump supporters had said, "Look, these immigrants aren't us. They came in the wrong way. We came in the right way." And people, place themselves on the side of law and order against what they just decided to even racialize as a criminal class of immigrants. And I think two things about it. ICE is kind of fully erase that distinction, or that idea that anybody with brown skin or anybody with an accent not immediately recognizable as a quote unquote American accent is available for attack, arrest, incarceration, beating, and even deportation, and even killing, right? And so I think that it turns out that Puerto Ricans suffer that fate right now in Florida, who are not immigrants at all. That people, it could go down a list of different Latino groups, but everybody's feeling it, and people are feeling it more and more. So I think that's true. I think it's also true that this administration is more ferociously, openly white nationalist than the prior Trump administration was. And really, I think certain right-wing groups have kind of shifted in that direction in a way that they did not before. I think Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA tried to push for a kind of a multicultural far-right politics, or at least conservative politics. And that's very different. I was at the Turning Point National Conference in December, and the number of Latino participants was far fewer than it had been when I had been there in 2023. And certainly it's true of Black participants as well.
Well, it seems, just in the broader sense, Joe, that the political conditions that made Biden unpopular back in 2024 are now almost identical to what's making Trump unpopular. And we're not even talking about the extent to which Biden's one and only debate with Trump was a catastrophe, because Biden seemed to be out of touch and mentally sort of foggy, to say the least. Whereas Trump is just manifestly falling apart before our eyes and becoming, at Davos, it was deeply embarrassing to have the United States represented by this addled human being that you couldn't, kept talking about Iceland instead of Greenland. So, in other words, the conditions that brought down Biden seem to be exactly the ones that are now weighing down Trump. But we haven't even gotten to the issue of the mental fitness of Trump.
I imagine that the people closest around Trump, his closest advisors and supporters, and people who see their future yoked to the MAGA movement, are well on their way to imagining a post-Trump future. And I think they're planning for that. Which has been true even since he was elected. Part of what Project 2025 was about was really anchoring far-right imperatives in government, so that with or without Trump, we will have gone down a road that destroys basic elements of public provision, which ideologically are culturally almost fascist. And I think that these things, these things as institutional gains for the right and the far right, become things that they hope to build on in future administrations. Now, it's you have Erica Kirk having already endorsed J.D. Vance for 2028. And I think people around Trump are trying to figure out who that's going to be, who's going to take that up for him. I don't think that they imagine that he is going to be a possible candidate. There's a lot of discussion about what will happen, but he's already a lame duck for the reasons that you just said, even in his first term. And I think he's lashing around like a lunatic in some ways, in ways that the most powerful human on the planet, when he does it, it has a lot of effects. But I think that they are hoping to figure out a way to just turn this into a permanent far right regime.
But isn't it conceivable that we'll have, I don't know how the 25th Amendment would ever emerge out of MAGA world and out of that cabinet of blind loyalists. And of course, it has to be triggered by J.D. Vance, right? The 25th Amendment.
Yeah. I think, I think people around Trump would probably happily do that. I think that they are afraid of him, and they are loyal to him because they know that the voting base of the Republican Party is so fanatically, fiercely pro-Trump. In terms of the Trumpists in government, they are doing everything they can to install a permanent regime change. In the electorate, it's really all about Trump still, and they all still really adore him. So I think it's very difficult for anyone to consider something like the 25th Amendment or trying to do anything except for kind of handle and steer Trump in whatever ways they can until the next election cycle.
So do you think that the Democrats should pile on a little bit more about the kind of demographics that we've been talking about that Trump won over, particularly amongst young, white, disaffected, not college educated? Some of them are incels. As you mentioned earlier, it was social media that galvanized this majority to vote for Trump in 2024, and that's still active. You got people like Joe Rogan now accusing ICE of acting like Gestapo. So there seems to be some fissures in that. But it would seem to me that with these neo-Nazis like Nick Fuentes being feted not just by Trump at Thanksgiving a couple of years ago, but also by Tucker Carlson, who certainly has presidential ambitions as well. I don't get the impression that the Democrats are taking a strong enough stance about more than a whiff of Nazism in the Republican Party.
No, they're not, particularly since this is something that would play well for them or work well for them. This is when the Trumpists were building a multiracial right, which I've written a lot about. It was seeming like this was going to be a very good strategy for them to really build out a durable coalition, which now would include Latinos, East Asians, South Asians, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, like kind of a broad group. And I think that is much less likely now when you have kind of, open Nazis, open white supremacists and anti-Semites like Nick Fuentes. And now Tucker Carlson has stepped on the gas with this, as you mentioned. I mean, he's, in the last week, he has repeatedly brought on Peter Brimelow the other day onto his show, who is a far-right eugenic racist, who is, he used to be an editor at Forbes and was drummed out because of his open white supremacy. And, so I think that is something that Democrats should really, really push hard on. But I really think more than that, I think, again, Mamdani really offered a way to not just point out to how horrible Republicans are, but how much better Democrats could make things. What kind of vision could you use? What kind of politics would win people over? What would make them think that their life is going to be better? What's possibly better? And economic precarity is a big one right now. And I think if you say, look, we want to soak the billionaire class, and we want to provide a possible future where people can either own a home or have a job with benefits and have health insurance. I mean, these are the things I think that Democrats should really, really push hard on in a way that while opposing fascism, while pointing out fascism for what it is. I think it's also, I think it's any Democrat who won't stand up now and say, we need to stop funding ICE, and many members of the House, including our own Hakeem Jeffries now, are unwilling to do that. But many other Democrats in the House are willing to do this now. There's an ICE abolition movement, which is growing. And I think these are things that many Americans, regardless of ideology, hate the idea of U.S. troops on streets. And I think this ICE thing has really turned against them in a way that they didn't expect, Republicans, I mean. And I think this is the kind of thing that, it's not just white supremacist ideology, but, the brutality of going door to door and pulling people out of their homes and beating them up and smashing car windows and yanking people out of them. These are things which are such clear violations of anything that anyone would consider American ideals or principles, that I think that this is something that Democrats should absolutely lean in on as hard as they can.
Well, Joe Lowndes, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me, and it's always a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Joe. And again, I've been speaking with Joseph Lowndes, who's a professor of political science at Hunter College and director of the public policy program at the Roosevelt House at the City University of New York, an expert on conservatism, the Tea Party, social movements, the GOP, race and elections. He's the author of From the New Deal to the New Right, Race and the Southern Origins of Modern Conservatism, and the co-author of Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity. We can take a brief station break back looking into how the Democratic House and Senate leaders appear unwilling to go to the mat to reform ICE. Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Will Bunch, a national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and author of several books, including The Backlash, Right-Wing Radicals, Paranoid Politics, and High-Def Hucksters in the Age of Obama, and The Byrne Identity, The Search for Bernie Sanders and the New American Dream. He's won numerous journalism awards and shared the Pulitzer Prize. And his latest article at the Philadelphia Inquirer is, When Will Democrats Realize That You Can't Reform Fascism? Welcome to Background Briefing, Will Bunch.
Yeah, Ian, thanks for having me back. I appreciate it.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the Democrats in the Senate are basically approving $10 billion for ICE with $18 billion for Customs and Border Protection. And apparently the compromises that were made were that ICE would provide $20 million for body cams worn by ICE and CBP officers, require de-escalation training of ICE and CBP agents, and remind officers of Americans' right to record any interactions that they have with them, and would also establish oversight and transparency of the agency's massive budget. But Senator, for example, Chris Murphy thinks that this is basically useless and that they've done nothing meaningful to change the reality of ISIS' campaign of brutality. So how do you see it, Will?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big problem with ICE and the whole, ICE regime, which includes Border Patrol and these other Homeland Security agencies, I think the big problem is one of culture, one of a totally broken culture. And, this notion that, if you give these people who, basically signed up to, because of animus towards people of color, or they signed up because, they get a thrill from, kind of rough and violent encounters with the public and whatnot. The idea that giving them a few more minutes of training, I think is just, the people who followed this whole thing is kind of laughable. And, a number of Democrats like Chris Murphy and a number of other Democrats I've seen in the last 24, 48 hours, get it. That there was a great line. There's a fantastic writer, Andrea Pitzer, who literally wrote the book on the history of concentration camps and has been, as you might guess, harshly critical of the whole ICE regime, and she has a line in her latest piece saying, nobody thought that the guards at Dachau needed more training. That might be kind of a reductio absurdum. It's kind of an extreme case, but the problem isn't training. The problem is the culture of this agency, the way it was created. And so this is why a number of people are saying, if you care about the future of democracy as much as you claim to care, do not give these people one more dollar to do what they're doing on the streets in Minneapolis. Just one last quick observation. I mean, right before this vote, the start of this week, we just saw a flurry of just horrific videos out of Minneapolis of little children being detained and people restrained on the ground, getting pepper sprayed, and just like awful stuff. And this is changing votes. Whether it's going to change enough votes to make a difference, it's hard to say.
Well, we're just learning today that a bunch of 4 school kids, including a 5-year-old boy, were just arrested by ICE. I mean, the cruelty is manifest. We also know from reporting from Eric Levitz at Vox that the ICE recruitment involves a lot of dog whistles, white supremacist dog whistles, to say the least, Nazi kind of implications, talking about the fatherland and purity and all of those Nazi terms. And even in the commercials that DHS has put out featuring Kristi Noem in various of her costumes, they talk about protecting our border and protecting and defending our culture. So what the hell does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely trying to recruit a certain kind of person, and it's working. They're getting that kind of person. So people look at this and say, we need to tear this agency down. There's a lot of there's a lot of hand wringing over the term abolish ICE. People thought that during Trump's first term that term was a loser for Democrats, and people tried to hang it around Kamala Harris and other candidates. But I think Ruben Gallego the other day said, well, we need to tear ICE down the way, or we need to demilitarize it, or there's a million maybe other ways to put it if you're worried about how the word abolish plays with the voters. I mean, it's a lot like the defund the police controversy, in that most serious people who came anywhere near a quote defund the police argument were saying, look, that we need public safety. We just don't need the type of public safety that we have in place now, that we need, community policing and different reforms. Well, the ICE debate is the same way. And, basically the argument is a couple things. One, ICE didn't even exist until 2003. So if we didn't need it before, how could we get back to kind of the regime before 2003 that wasn't so problematic? And the idea is basically tear down this thing that we have now that's gone so far off the rails and start from scratch. Because there are very few people, for all the talk that gets thrown around about open borders, there's not many people who believe in totally unregulated open borders. I think most liberals, most progressives would agree that if somebody comes to this country who's an actual criminal, who actually, that the cases that you do get where somebody actually is a rapist or a murderer or whatever, that, we need some kind of mechanism to, track those people down and not have them roaming around our country. But that's not what ICE has become at this point. It's become, this kind of paramilitary secret police force answering to Trump. And, Democrats, I don't know how they could justify voting to continue that at this point.
Well, apparently, Patty Murray didn't really have too much room to maneuver, because if you shut down DHS, you also shut down FEMA and TSA, but ICE will continue to operate because they have got this separate pot of funding that the Republicans gave them from Trump's big, beautiful bill. And the point is that I think they should be telling the American public, in case they don't realize it, that we're paying for these thugs to beat up our fellow citizens. And not only are we paying for it because the money that's been going to ICE, the 170 billion that was in the big beautiful bill for DHS, that's at the expense of people's health care. And it also is a part of giving tax breaks to billionaires.
Yeah, I mean, these arguments should be political no-brainers, at this point. And if you look at the polling, and there's been a lot of polling in recent days, and it shows, ICE and Trump's immigration policies are hugely unpopular, not just with Democrats, but independents, and even with a growing number of Republicans. And there was a poll last week that for the first time you had a 46-43 plurality of voters saying, yes, we do want to abolish ICE. Using that loaded term, they still said, yes, abolish it altogether. That's the plurality position at this point, almost a majority position. And, so the Democrats really risk falling behind the voters. And it's interesting. I do feel that there's this sudden realization that voters are so mad about what they're seeing out of Minneapolis and elsewhere that, that stalwarts of the Democratic Party could face primary challenges if they don't come around on this. I mean, could face successful primary challenges. So it's changed it's a hard situation to talk about because, as you know, it's very fluid right now. It seems to be changing by the hour. I mean, there's certainly a lot of momentum to do more to try and shut down or restrain ICE. But, what are the realities on Capitol Hill? I mean, obviously, the Republicans still do have a 3-vote majority in the House, and then the Senate's a whole nother kettle of fish. So, right, you have to deal with the reality of what's possible. But, I think there's definitely some good positive momentum for, saying, why are we still funding these people? Why are we paying for this?
Right, but Pam Bondi is doubling down, going after demonstrators who went into the church. That was the pastor who was a top guy in ICE. And all Trump has said about it was a sad thing that the woman got shot. But her father voted for him, and he went on about that. And again, all Trump can do is talk about himself. It's all about him, not about her.
Yeah, I mean the insanity of Trump, that it's only a tragedy if a family of Trump voters is affected. That if it had been a family of Biden voters, it wouldn't have really mattered. I guess it's just unbelievable. And ICE is clearly looking for. ICE and Kristi Noem and Homeland Security are clearly looking for propaganda opportunities. And the protest in the church, I understand the reasoning behind it. I think the organizers maybe should have been savvy to realize how this was going to play out in today's media environment, because they're looking for anything that can make the protesters look bad. And the truth is, most of what's happening in Minneapolis right now is everyday folks. So call them wine moms if you want or whatever, but just regular people who are outraged by what's going on, and that's hard for the MAGA movement to accept. And then so they're desperately trying to change the conversation away from that.
But Trump's been toying with the Insurrection Act, and isn't it pretty clear that the real fear and the real threat is, and maybe this is all a rehearsal for September as we get close to the midterms, where he's going to invade democratic cities like Minneapolis and states like Minnesota to suppress the vote on the Democratic side.
Yeah, I think that could be true. I think when you look at the way the ICE brigade in Minneapolis has been behaving over the last couple of days, there is this feeling that they're trying to provoke something, and if they provoke something, then it's much more likely that Trump will invoke the Insurrection Act. So it's hard to say. I mean, it could be. I keep going back to January 6th. I think Trump wanted to send in troops, but only if there were, quote Antifa unquote types for the troops to fight. And when it was only his people, he was hamstrung. So all this talk about not taking the bait. Well, yeah, I kind of hope the Minneapolis protesters stay strong, but that they don't cross any lines that give Trump ammunition to do this, because they would like to do this, I think.
So do you think, though, that Democrats, particularly some of the leading candidates for possible presidency, our governor here in California, Newsom, should they start using the F word, fascism?
It's, I can relate to this issue as a columnist because I go through it too. Because you always have to worry about using terminology that some people are going to say, "Oh, come on," like fascism, really. But it's a shame because obviously, if you actually read about the real life history of fascism, and they've hit so many of the marks at this point. And I mean, my belief. I understand both sides, but my belief is you've got to be out there and call it for what it is. You're not gonna succeed by pretending it's something that it's not. So I think so. I think going into the 2026 election, I think you'll see the candidates who are most speak most clearly about these issues and are most direct and aren't trying to avoid confrontation. I think are the ones who are going to succeed, whether it's in the midterms or whether it's boosting their standing in the 2028 presidential race. I think Democrats are really looking for people who are fighters and not people trying to make a deal and make concessions.
Right, and the fact that the Democrats are depending upon Joe Rogan to help them out by calling ICE a bunch of Gestapo, that's to me is an example of a failure on their part.
Yeah, and if Democrats were smart, they'd say, well, look, if popular figures like Joe Rogan or Bruce Springsteen are calling these people the Gestapo, maybe I need to up my game, because, and you watch those videos, you watch the Springsteen video, or you watch Mamdani was on The View this week talking about abolishing ICE, and you listen to the applause from people in the audience, that this is not a, ooh, did he say that? It's like, no, yeah, we're with you, So, I think a smart politician should watch that and take notice. So,
well, Will Bunch, I appreciate you joining us here today.
Yeah, Ian, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate you inviting me on again.
And I've been speaking with Will Bunch, a national opinion columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer and author of several books, including The Backlash, Right-Wing Radicals, Paranoia, Politics, and High-Def Hucksters in the Age of Obama, and The Byrne Identity, A Search for Bernie Sanders and the New American Dream. He's won numerous journalism awards and shared the Pulitzer Prize. And his latest article at the Philadelphia Inquirer is When Will Democrats Realize That You Can't Reform Fascism? And this has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producers Graham Fitzgibbon, Asher Price, and Sasha Linden-Cohen. If you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we include extended interviews, searchable by topic, and have made it easier for you to sign up for daily email updates and provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we highly encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter, Blue Sky, and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and our new social media manager, Luke Susswood, is also posting highlights from the show on YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram at Ian Masters Media. So please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And to help sustain this program into the future and ensure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate and/or at publictruthmedia.org, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And I'll be back tomorrow with another Background Briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
One more